Jake Carter checked his equipment one more time before stepping into the dark hallway. The abandoned research facility on Thesra Prime gave him an uneasy feeling. Something about empty buildings always did. They felt wrong, like a body without a soul. Beside him, Kira adjusted her scanner and made a soft clicking sound. That was how her species showed they were nervous. Jake had worked with the Velrathi scientist for 6 months now, long enough to read her moods. She didn't like this place either. "Let's make this quick," Jake said, his voice echoing off the metal walls. "Survey the main labs, grab some data files, and get back to the ship before dark." Kira nodded. Her large eyes reflected the light from Jake's helmet lamp. She was small compared to humans, maybe 5 feet tall, with pale blue skin and delicate features. But Jake had learned not to judge her by appearance. She was tougher than she looked. They moved through the facility together. The air smelled stale and old. Dust covered everything. According to the records, people had left this place 40 years ago. One day everyone just packed up and left. No explanation in the official files, just evacuation orders and sealed records. That was why Jake and Kira were here. The Exploration Council wanted to know if Thesra Prime was safe for new colonists. They needed answers about why the first colony failed. Jake's boots crunched on broken glass as they entered a large laboratory. Computer terminals lined the walls, all dark and dead. Kira went straight to the nearest console and pulled out a portable power cell. She was good with technology. Better than most humans Jake knew. While Kira worked on accessing the old files, Jake explored the room. He found cabinets full of sample containers, all empty. Drawers with research notes that had turned yellow with age. Everything looked normal for a research station. Nothing that would explain a sudden evacuation. Then the floor shook. Jake grabbed a table to steady himself. "Earthquake?" he asked. Kira looked up from her work, her translator device converting her clicks and chirps into human speech. "No seismic activity detected before we landed." "This is something else." The shaking got worse. Jake heard a loud groan from somewhere deep below them. Metal screaming under pressure. Then a crash that made his ears ring. "We need to leave," Jake said, reaching for Kira. Before they could move, water exploded through a ventilation grate in the floor. The spray hit Jake in the face, cold and shocking. More water burst through other vents around the room. Within seconds, it was pooling on the floor. "The containment systems must have failed," Kira said, backing toward the door. "The underground reservoirs are flooding the lower levels." Jake ran to the exit, but the door had already sealed itself. Emergency protocols. The facility's automated systems were trying to contain the flood by locking down each section. It was trapping them inside. He slammed his fist against the metal door. "Override codes. We need the override codes." Kira was already working on it, her fingers flying over her portable terminal. But the water kept rising. It was at their ankles now, then their knees. The pressure from below was immense. This wasn't just a leak. This was a complete system failure. Jake waded over to the computer terminals. "Can you get power to the door controls?" "Working on it," Kira replied. Her voice stayed calm, but her hands moved faster. "The backup generators are offline. I need to reroute power from the emergency systems." The water reached Jake's waist. It was freezing cold, much colder than he expected. His uniform was already soaked through and the weight was pulling him down. Military-grade fabric was tough and durable, but it absorbed water like a sponge. Every movement became harder. He looked at Kira. Her environmental suit was filling with water through a tear in the side. She must have snagged it on something when they entered the facility. The suit was designed to protect her from hostile atmospheres, but now it was becoming a death trap. "Kira, your suit," Jake said, pointing. She looked down and her eyes widened. Water was pooling inside the suit around her legs. The weight would drag her under soon. The water climbed to their chests. Jake's teeth started chattering. The cold was getting worse. His fingers felt numb. If they stayed in these wet clothes much longer, hypothermia would kill them before drowning did. "We have to get out of these," Jake said, already pulling at his uniform jacket. "The weight will pull us under." Kira hesitated. Her species had different views about modesty than humans, but she was smart enough to understand the danger. She nodded and started unsealing her suit. Jake stripped off his jacket and shirt, throwing them away from the rising water. His pants were next. The soaked fabric clung to his legs, and he had to fight to pull it off. He kept his underwear on, but everything else had to go. Kira struggled with her suit. The seals were jammed from the water damage. Jake waded over to help her, working the emergency releases until the suit came apart. She stepped out of it wearing only a thin undergarment that her species used for comfort inside their suits. They both shivered in the freezing water, now up to their shoulders. Jake could see Kira's lips turning darker blue. That was a bad sign for her species. It meant her core temperature was dropping. "Come here," Jake said, pulling her close. Body heat was all they had now. Kira didn't argue. She pressed against him, and they held each other in the rising water. Jake kept one arm around Kira and used the other to work on the power systems. His fingers barely responded to his commands. The cold made everything harder, but he had to keep trying. The door was their only way out. Kira's translator sparked and went dead. Water had gotten into its circuits. Now they couldn't talk to each other properly. She made clicking sounds and pointed at things, trying to communicate. Jake did his best to understand. The water rose past their chins. They had to tilt their heads back to breathe. Jake found a pipe running along the ceiling and grabbed it, pulling both of them up. They clung to the pipe, their heads in the small air pocket that remained. "I've got it," Jake gasped, finally getting a response from the backup power systems. A terminal screen flickered to life nearby, casting blue light across the water's surface. "I can reroute power to the door." But as the screen loaded, Jake saw something that made his blood run colder than the water. There were files on this terminal, research logs, and the first thing he saw was a warning label in bright red letters. Containment breach protocol, biological hazard, neural pathogen, evacuation order. Jake stared at the screen. This facility wasn't just abandoned because of old age or economic problems. It was evacuated because of something dangerous, something biological. And now he and Kira were trapped in water that might be contaminated. He looked at Kira, who was watching the screen too. Even without her translator, she could read human text. Her eyes met his, and he saw fear there for the first time since they had met. The water wasn't just drowning them. It might be killing them in a much worse way, and they had been swimming in it, skin exposed, for several minutes already. Jake's mind raced. They needed to get out of this room. They needed to get to their ship. But more than that, they needed to know what they had been exposed to, because if it was something dangerous, they couldn't risk bringing it back to populated worlds. The water continued to rise, pushing them harder against the ceiling. They had maybe 2 minutes of air left. Jake had to make a choice, and he had to make it now. Jake forced himself to focus on the screen. His lungs burned from holding his breath in the small air pocket. Beside him, Kira clung to the same pipe, her face barely above the water. They had seconds, maybe less. His numb fingers worked the terminal controls. The door needed power. Everything else could wait. He bypassed safety protocols and dumped all available energy into the door mechanism. The screen flickered and went dark for a moment. Then he heard it. The sound of locks disengaging. "Go!" Jake shouted, though his voice came out as barely a whisper. They both took deep breaths and dove under. The door had opened just enough for them to squeeze through. Jake pushed Kira ahead of him, making sure she got out first. The corridor beyond was flooded too, but there was air at the top. They surfaced together, gasping and coughing. But this corridor was different. Jake noticed it immediately. The water here glowed, not bright, but with a faint blue-green light that came from tiny particles floating in the liquid. Like stars in a dark sky. It would have been beautiful if it wasn't so terrifying. Kira saw it too. She grabbed Jake's arm and made urgent clicking sounds. Even without her translator, her meaning was clear. This was wrong. This was dangerous. Jake wanted to tell her he knew, that he had seen the warnings on the terminal. But she couldn't understand him now, and there was no time for pantomime. The water was still rising. They needed to find higher ground or another way out. They swam down the corridor, the glowing particles swirling around them with every movement. Jake tried not to think about what they were, tried not to imagine them seeping into his skin, getting into his bloodstream. But the thoughts came anyway. The corridor led to a junction. Jake pulled himself up to read the signs on the wall. Most were faded and unreadable. But one sign still showed clear text: Emergency Systems Level 3. An arrow pointed to the right. He grabbed Kira and pointed. She nodded. They swam in that direction. The water was getting warmer here. That seemed wrong. The flood had been ice-cold before. Why would it warm up? Unless something was heating it. Unless something was alive in it. Jake's scientific training tried to kick in. Bioluminescent organisms needed energy. They produced light through chemical reactions. If these particles were alive, they would generate heat as a byproduct. The warming water wasn't a good sign. It meant there were a lot of them. Millions, maybe billions. They reached a stairwell. The water hadn't filled it completely yet. They climbed up, their bare feet slipping on the wet metal steps. At the top was another sealed door, but this one had a manual override. Jake cranked the wheel until the locks released. They stumbled into a new room and slammed the door behind them. This room was some kind of observation deck. Large windows looked down into what must have been a testing chamber. And miracle of miracles, this room was dry. The water hadn't reached it yet, but it would. The sound of rushing liquid came from everywhere, echoing through the walls. Jake and Kira collapsed on the floor, shivering. Without their clothes, the air temperature felt like ice against their wet skin. Jake looked around for anything they could use. He found emergency blankets in a wall cabinet, the kind that reflected body heat. He wrapped one around Kira and one around himself, but blankets wouldn't save them if the water kept rising. And blankets wouldn't help if those glowing particles were already inside them, doing whatever they were designed to do. Kira moved to a computer terminal in the corner. She was always thinking ahead, always looking for information. Jake joined her, and together they got the terminal powered up using her portable battery pack. The files that appeared made Jake's stomach twist. Research reports, test results, video logs, all stamped with the same red warning, classified. Extreme biohazard, containment protocol alpha. Jake opened the first video file. A woman's face appeared on the screen. She looked tired and scared. The timestamp showed it was recorded 40 years ago, just days before the evacuation. "This is Dr. Lisa Hayes, Chief Research Officer," the woman said. "I'm recording this as a final warning. The project has failed. The entities cannot be contained. We thought we could study them safely, but we were wrong." Jake leaned closer to the screen. Kira watched too, her eyes reflecting the blue light of the monitor. Dr. Hayes continued, "The entities are not simple organisms. They are complex, possibly intelligent. They exist in a crystalline state in the deep ocean of Thessera Prime. When exposed to warmth and organic material, they activate. They seek out nervous systems. Any nervous system. Human, Vilrathi, anything with neurons." The doctor's hand shook as she pulled up an image. It showed a microscopic view of the entities. They looked like tiny snowflakes made of glass, each one perfectly formed. Beautiful and deadly. Once they make contact with skin, they have approximately 20 minutes to penetrate to the bloodstream. From there, they travel to the brain and spinal cord. The infection process takes about 48 hours. After that, the host is no longer in control. The entities form a collective consciousness. All infected individuals become part of a hive mind with one goal: spread to new hosts. Jake felt sick. He looked at his arms, his legs, searching for any sign of infection. How long had they been in the water? 10 minutes? 15? He couldn't remember. Time had become a blur of cold and fear. Dr. Hayes wiped tears from her face. "We are evacuating the planet. All research materials are being destroyed. The facility will be sealed. If anyone finds this recording, understand this. Thessera Prime must remain quarantined. The entities must never reach populated worlds. If they do, there may be no stopping them." The video ended. The screen went dark. Kira made a low, mournful sound. She understood what they had seen, what it meant for both of them. They had been swimming in contaminated water. The entities were probably on their skin right now, working their way in. Jake refused to give up. He scrolled through more files, searching desperately for anything useful. There had to be something. Some treatment, some cure, some way to fight back. He found it buried in the medical research files, a decontamination protocol. The original researchers had developed a way to kill the entities before they reached the nervous system. It involved electromagnetic pulses and chemical compounds. The process was described as extremely painful but effective if used within the first 30 minutes of exposure. Jake read faster. There was a decontamination chamber. It was designed specifically for this purpose. And according to the facility map, it was in the next section over, the section they had just left. The section that was probably completely flooded by now. He showed Kira the screen. She read it and looked at him with those large, luminous eyes. She understood. One of them would have to go back into the contaminated water. They would have to swim through those glowing particles, letting them swarm closer to infection. and they would have to do it fast. Jake checked the time on the terminal. They had been exposed for about 12 minutes. That gave them 18 minutes to reach the decontamination chamber and run the protocol, maybe less if the entities worked faster than the old research predicted. He started to stand, but Kira pushed him back down. She pointed at herself, then at the door. She was volunteering to go, to swim through that toxic water alone. Jake shook his head hard. No way, he wasn't letting her take that risk. He was bigger, stronger, and his species had a reputation for surviving things that killed others. Humans were stubborn that way. They endured. Kira grabbed his face with both hands, forcing him to look at her. She clicked and chirped, frustrated that he couldn't understand. Then she did something unexpected. She pulled up her own research data on her portable device. It showed Velrothi physiology. She pointed at specific details: enhanced cellular regeneration, faster immune response, higher resistance to toxins. She was telling him that she had better odds, that her species could fight off the initial stages of infection longer than humans could, that she should be the one to risk it. Jake wanted to argue. Every instinct told him to protect her, but the data didn't lie. She was right. If anyone could make that swim and survive, it was Kira. He hated it, but he nodded. Kira's expression softened. She touched his cheek gently, a gesture of thanks and trust. Then she stood and moved to the door. Jake grabbed her hand before she could leave. He couldn't speak her language, but he could show her what he needed her to understand. He tapped his chest, then pointed at her. Then he made a motion of pulling, bringing her back. He would not leave her behind. If she went into that water, she was coming back. That was not negotiable. Kira's eyes glistened. She squeezed his hand once hard. Then she let go and opened the door. The water had risen to the top of the stairs. Kira didn't hesitate. She dove in, and the glowing particles swarmed around her like hungry insects. Jake watched until she disappeared around the corner. Then he was alone with the terminal and the ticking clock. 17 minutes left. Jake stared at the empty doorway where Kira had vanished. Every second felt like an hour. He forced himself to turn back to the terminal and pull up the facility schematics. If he was going to help her, he needed to understand exactly what they were dealing with. The decontamination chamber was in Laboratory 7, 2 corridors over. The layout showed it as a cylindrical tube with various equipment mounted around it. According to the specifications, it could process one person at a time. The treatment lasted 4 minutes. 4 minutes of pure agony if the medical notes were accurate. Jake read the warnings attached to the protocol. Severe pain, possible cardiac arrest, risk of permanent nerve damage, use only in life-threatening situations. Well, this definitely qualified as life-threatening. He checked the time again. 14 minutes since exposure. Kira had been in the contaminated water for 3 minutes now. The entities on her skin had already had more time to penetrate deeper. Jake's hands curled into fists. He should have gone. He should have insisted. A noise from the stairwell made him jump. Splashing. Someone was coming back up. Jake rushed to the door and pulled it open. Kira emerged from the water, gasping for breath. Her blue skin looked darker now, and Jake could see faint lines spreading across her arms and shoulders. The entities were visible beneath her skin, like veins of light. The infection had started. Jake pulled her out and slammed the door. She was shaking badly. He wrapped the emergency blanket around her again, but she pushed it away. There was no time for comfort. She held up her portable device with trembling hands. The screen showed a map. She had marked the route to the decontamination chamber. But there was a problem. The path she had scouted was completely flooded. No air pockets, no rest stops. It would require a full underwater swim of at least 60 seconds, maybe more if the currents were strong. Jake looked at the glowing lines under Kira's skin. They were spreading slowly but surely. How much worse would they get if she went back into that water? How much more could her body take before the entities reached her brain? Kira seemed to read his thoughts. She pointed at the map again, then at herself. She was telling him she had to go back. The chamber needed to be activated from the inside. Someone had to swim there, get in, and start the process. Then that person had to endure the decontamination while the other person monitored from outside. But that wasn't the full problem. Jake studied the technical details. The chamber required power. A lot of power, more than Kira's portable battery could provide. They needed to get the facility's backup generators online, and those were in the basement. Underwater. Under contaminated water filled with billions of entities. Jake pointed this out to Kira by pulling up the power grid on the terminal. She looked at it and slumped against the wall. She understood. This wasn't a simple rescue anymore. This was a multi-stage operation with very little time and two people who were both infected. Because Jake was infected too. He hadn't wanted to accept it, but the truth was undeniable. He felt it now, a tingling sensation across his skin, a slight burning in his fingertips. The entities were in him too, maybe not as far along as Kira's infection, but present, active, spreading. They had maybe 12 minutes left before the point of no return. 12 minutes to reach the generators, restore power, get to the decontamination chamber, and treat both of them. It was impossible. The math didn't work unless they split up. Jake pulled up two maps side by side. One showing the route to the generators, one showing the route to the decontamination chamber. If he went for the generators while Kira went to the chamber, they could save time. He would restore power, she would be in position, and they could run the decontamination as soon as everything was ready. The problem was that whoever went to the generators would have a longer swim through deeper water. And the generator room had no guaranteed air pocket. It was a one-way trip unless the power came back on and the pumps started draining the flood. Kira saw what he was planning. She grabbed his arm and shook her head violently. No, she wouldn't let him sacrifice himself. Jake gently removed her hand. He was going to the generators. That was final. He was human, and humans had one advantage that no other species could match. They were too stubborn to know when to quit. They pushed past limits that should have killed them. They survived things that had no right to be survivable. He had read the stories. Humans lost in space for weeks. Humans trapped under rubble for days. Humans fighting diseases that melted their organs from the inside. And somehow, impossibly, they lived. They found a way. That was what humans did. Jake wasn't smarter than Kira. He wasn't tougher in any measurable way. But he had something that made him perfect for this suicide mission. He had an unreasonable, illogical, absolutely human refusal to accept that he was going to die today. He started preparing. He found a waterproof pouch in the emergency supplies and sealed Kira's portable device inside. She would need it to operate the decontamination chamber. He made sure she understood the sequence by showing her the technical diagram step by step. She watched him with tears streaming down her face. Her species didn't cry the same way humans did, but the emotion was universal. She knew what he was planning. She knew the odds. Jake gave her the device and pointed at the map. Her route was marked clearly. She nodded slowly. Then she grabbed him and held on tight. For a moment, they just stood there, two people from different worlds facing death together. When Kira finally let go, Jake saw something change in her expression. Determination. She wasn't going to waste his sacrifice. If he was brave enough to risk everything, she would match his courage. They would both make it. They would both survive. There was no other option. Jake opened the door to the stairwell. The water had risen another foot. It churned and swirled with currents from the flood pressure below. The glowing particles danced in the liquid like fireflies, beautiful and deadly. He looked back at Kira one more time. She stood ready, the emergency blanket discarded. Her small frame somehow seemed bigger now, stronger. She wasn't the delicate alien scientist anymore. She was a survivor, a fighter. Jake dove into the water. The cold hit him like a physical blow. Worse than before because he knew what was in this water now. Every particle that touched his skin was another potential death sentence. But he swam anyway, down the stairs through the corridor, following the path he had memorized from the map. The generator room was 3 levels down. Jake swam through flooded hallways, past doors that had buckled under the pressure, around debris that had broken loose in the surge. His lungs burned. His muscles screamed. But he kept going. He found the stairwell that led down. The water here moved faster, pulled by gravity and the ongoing flood. Jake let the current take him. It was faster than swimming, and he needed every second. The world became a blur of blue-green light and dark metal. Jake lost track of which way was up. He just followed the pulling sensation of the current, trusting it to take him where he needed to go. His lungs were on fire. He needed air. But there was no surface here, just water in every direction. His vision started to dim at the edges. The entities in his blood seemed to pulse with each heartbeat, as if they could sense his weakness. No, not yet. Not now. Jake kicked harder, pulled himself forward. His hand touched something solid. A door frame. He grabbed it and hauled himself through. This was it. The generator room. The map had been accurate. Emergency lighting strips still glowed faintly on the ceiling, running on the last drops of battery power. They cast just enough light for Jake to see the massive machines that had once powered the entire facility. And there on the far wall, the manual restart mechanism. A big red lever protected by a safety cage. Jake's lungs were going to explode. Black spots danced in his vision. He had seconds. Maybe less. He swam to the lever. The safety cage was locked. Of course it was locked. Nothing could be easy. Jake grabbed the cage and pulled. The metal groaned but held. He braced his feet against the wall and pulled again with everything he had left. The cage broke. The metal snapped and Jake went tumbling backward. He didn't care. He grabbed the lever and threw his full weight down on it. Nothing happened. Jake pulled again. Still nothing. Why wasn't it working? Then he saw the problem. The lever was just the manual release. The generator still needed a startup sequence. There was a control panel next to it with buttons and switches, and Jake needed to breathe before he could even think about operating it. His body made the decision for him. His mouth opened involuntarily, trying to gasp for air. Water rushed in. Jake's training kicked in. He forced himself to close his mouth to swallow the small amount of water he had taken in. Don't panic. Don't inhale. Find air. He looked up. The ceiling here was high, very high. If there was any air pocket in this facility, it would be at the top of this room. Jake pushed off from the generators and swam straight up. His head broke through the surface. Air. Glorious, beautiful air. Jake gasped and coughed, his body trying to expel the water he had swallowed. He was in a tiny pocket of air, maybe 2 feet between the water and the ceiling. It smelled like rust and mold, but he didn't care. He could breathe. He floated there for 30 seconds, recovering. The glowing lines under his skin were brighter now, spreading faster. He could feel the entities working their way deeper. 8 minutes left, maybe 7. Time was running out for both him and Kira. Jake took 3 deep breaths and dove back down to the control panel. Jake worked the control panel underwater, his fingers moving by feel more than sight. The emergency lighting was fading fast. He pressed buttons in the sequence he had memorized from the terminal. Primary systems check, fuel line verification, cooling system bypass. Each step had to be perfect or the generators wouldn't start. His lungs started burning again. He ignored it and kept working. 2 more switches. 1 final button. The panel's lights flickered from red to amber. Almost there. Jake pulled the manual lever again. This time something deep inside the generators responded. A vibration ran through the water. Then a grinding sound as ancient machinery tried to wake up after 40 years of sleep. Come on, Jake thought. Come on, you old beast. The grinding became a rumble, then a steady hum. The generators were running. Lights began flickering on throughout the room. The facility was coming back to life. Jake's vision was fading again. He needed air. He pushed off the panel and swam upward, but something was wrong. The water was moving differently now, pulling him down instead of letting him rise. The pumps. The generators had activated the emergency pumps and they were creating powerful currents. Jake fought against the pull. His arms felt like lead. His legs barely responded. The entities in his system were multiplying, feeding on his exhaustion. He could feel them spreading through his chest, reaching toward his heart. No, not yet. Kira needs the power. She needs me to hold on just a little longer. Jake broke the surface and gasped for air. The water level was dropping now, slowly but steadily. The pumps were doing their job. In a few minutes, this room would be walkable. But Jake didn't have a few minutes. None of that mattered if he couldn't get to Kira. He floated in the shrinking air pocket, gathering his strength. The glowing lines under his skin now covered his arms, his chest, his legs. They pulsed with a rhythm that almost matched his heartbeat. The entities were synchronizing with his nervous system. Stage 2 of the infection. He had maybe 5 minutes before Stage 3, where they reached his brain. Jake dove one more time. He swam back through the corridors, fighting the currents created by the pumps. The facility was draining, but not fast enough. There was still too much water, too much distance to cover. His muscles cramped, his vision tunneled. But Jake kept swimming. He thought about Kira waiting in the decontamination chamber. She was counting on him. He couldn't let her down. Humans didn't give up. They endured. They survived. That was what made them special. Jake reached the stairwell and pulled himself up. The water was lower here, only waist deep on the first level. He could walk now. He dragged himself forward, using the walls for support. Laboratory 7 was just ahead. The door was open. Emergency lights blazed inside. And there, in the center of the room, stood the decontamination chamber. A cylinder of metal and glass with cables and tubes running to equipment mounted on the walls. Kira stood beside it. When she saw Jake, her eyes went wide. The glowing lines under his skin were worse than hers now. Much worse. He had been in the contaminated water longer, swimming through the deepest concentrations of entities. His infection was accelerating. Jake stumbled toward her. He needed to tell her to get in the chamber, to start the treatment. But his throat wasn't working right. The entities were affecting his nervous system, making his muscles twitch and spasm. Kira caught him before he fell. She was stronger than she looked. She pulled Jake toward the chamber, but he shook his head. No. Her first. She had to survive. If only one of them made it out of this, it had to be her. She was too valuable. Too smart. The galaxy needed people like Kira, but Kira wasn't listening. She dragged him to the chamber and pushed him inside. The door sealed automatically. Through the glass, Jake could see her working the external controls. She had the portable device connected to the system. Her fingers moved across the interface with desperate speed. Jake pounded on the glass. This was wrong. She needed treatment first. Her infection might be less severe, but it had started earlier. She had less time. He tried to tell her this, but the chamber was soundproof. Kira looked up at him through the glass. She placed one hand against it, and her expression said everything. I know what I'm doing, trust me. You're more infected than I am. You go first or we both die. Jake wanted to argue, but deep down he knew she was right. His body was shutting down. The entities were winning. If he didn't get treatment in the next minute, he would lose consciousness. And then Kira would be alone with no one to operate the chamber for her. He stopped fighting and nodded. Kira's face relaxed slightly. She entered the final commands. The chamber hummed to life. Warning lights began flashing. A computerized voice spoke in a language Jake didn't understand, but the tone was clear. This was going to hurt. The electromagnetic emitters activated first. Jake felt the pulse instantly. Every nerve in his body fired at once. It was like being struck by lightning while someone poured acid into his veins. He screamed but couldn't hear his own voice over the sound of the equipment. The entities in his system fought back. They were trying to survive, to protect themselves. They sent false signals through Jake's nervous system, creating hallucinations. He saw the chamber filling with water, felt himself drowning. But it wasn't real. It was the entities trying to make him panic, trying to make him stop the treatment. Jake forced his eyes open and looked at Kira through the glass. She was watching him, her hand still pressed against the barrier. Her presence anchored him, reminded him what was real and what wasn't. He focused on her face and endured. The chemical spray came next. Jets of liquid shot from nozzles in the chamber walls, coating Jake's skin. It burned worse than anything he had ever felt. Like fire mixed with ice mixed with broken glass, the chemicals were designed to break down the entity's crystalline structure, to dissolve them before they could complete the infection. Jake's back arched. His muscles locked. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. There was only pain, pure and absolute. The entities were dying and they were taking pieces of him with them. He could feel them fragmenting in his bloodstream, their sharp edges cutting him from the inside. The treatment lasted 4 minutes. 4 minutes that felt like hours, like years, like an eternity of suffering. But Jake held on. He didn't let himself pass out. He stayed conscious through sheer force of will because Kira needed him conscious. She needed him to walk out of this chamber and operate the controls for her turn. When it finally ended, the chamber door opened with a hiss. Jake collapsed onto the floor outside. His skin was red and raw. His muscles twitched uncontrollably. But he was alive. And more importantly, he was clean. The glowing lines were gone. The entities were dead. Kira knelt beside him. Her infection was worse now. The lines covered most of her body, pulsing faster. She had maybe 3 minutes left. She helped Jake to his feet and pushed him toward the control panel. He had to do this now. There was no time to recover. Jake's hand shook as he worked the controls. Everything hurt. Every movement was agony. but he entered the commands anyway. He activated the decontamination sequence for Kira. She climbed into the chamber and sealed the door. Through the glass, Jake could see the fear in her eyes. She had watched what the treatment did to him. She knew what was coming. But she also knew there was no choice. This or death. This or becoming a puppet for a hive mind. This or spreading the infection to billions of innocent people. Jake pressed the final button. The chamber activated, and Kira began to scream. Jake watched through the glass, his heart breaking with every second. Kira's small body convulsed as the electromagnetic pulses tore through her. The chemical spray coated her skin, burning away the entities along with layers of her own cells. She fell to her knees, then to her side, writhing in pain. But she didn't pass out. Just like Jake, she stayed conscious. She was tougher than anyone would guess from looking at her. The Velrothi might seem delicate, but they had survived wars and plagues and the cold darkness of space. Kira was proof of that strength. The 4 minutes passed. The chamber opened. Kira crawled out and collapsed next to Jake. They lay there together on the cold floor, both barely conscious, both in more pain than they thought possible. But alive. Clean. Free of infection. The emergency pumps continued draining water from the facility. The generators hummed steadily. And 2 survivors, one human and one alien, breathed in the stale air and knew they had won. But they weren't safe yet. Not really. They still needed to get out of this facility. Still needed to reach their ship. Still needed to report what they had found and make sure no one ever risked opening this place again. Jake rolled onto his side and looked at Kira. She looked back at him. No words were needed. They both understood. They had survived the worst. They could survive the rest. Jake forced himself to sit up. His muscles screamed in protest, but he ignored them. He grabbed the emergency blankets and wrapped one around Kira, then one around himself. Their clothes were long gone, lost to the flood. But that didn't matter now. Modesty was meaningless after what they had been through. Kira's translator device had dried enough to function again. She pressed it against her throat and spoke. The device converted her clicks and chirps into human language. "Can you walk?" she asked. Jake tested his legs. They held his weight barely. "Yeah, can you?" "Yes." "Then let's get out of here." They helped each other stand and made their way toward the exit. Jake and Kira moved through the facility slowly. Every step hurt. Their bodies had been through trauma that should have killed them. The decontamination process was designed to save lives, but it wasn't gentle. It destroyed as much as it healed. The water had drained to ankle depth on most levels. The pumps worked steadily, pushing the contaminated liquid back into the sealed reservoirs where it belonged. Emergency lights lit their path, casting long shadows on the metal walls. They reached the stairwell that led to ground level. 20 steps. That was all. But it might as well have been 20 miles. Jake went first, using the handrail to pull himself up. Kira followed close behind, her breathing labored. At the top, they found the main entrance. The door was sealed, but the power was back online. Jake worked the controls with shaking fingers. The locks disengaged. The door slid open. Fresh air rushed in, carrying the scent of the alien forest outside. They stepped out into the evening light. The sun was setting on Thessera Prime, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. Jake had never seen anything so beautiful. They had made it out. They were alive, but Jake's training reminded him they weren't done yet. They needed to reach the ship. They needed to send a warning about this facility. And they needed medical attention. Real medical attention, not just emergency decontamination. The ship was 2 miles away across rough terrain. Jake looked at Kira. She met his eyes and nodded. They could make it. They had come this far. 2 miles was nothing compared to what they had already survived. They started walking. The ground was uneven, covered in twisted roots and strange plants. Jake's bare feet found every sharp rock and thorny branch. Kira fared slightly better with her tougher Velrothi skin, but she still winced with each step. Halfway to the ship, Kira stumbled. Jake caught her before she fell. She tried to stand on her own, but her legs wouldn't support her weight anymore. The infection and the treatment had taken too much. Her body was shutting down. Jake didn't hesitate. He picked her up, cradling her against his chest. She was lighter than he expected. Or maybe adrenaline was giving him strength he didn't really have. "I can walk," Kira protested through her translator. Save your energy, Jake replied. We're almost there. He carried her the rest of the way. His muscles burned. His vision swam. But he kept moving, one foot in front of the other. That was all he had to do. Just keep moving. The ship appeared through the trees. Their small exploration vessel, exactly where they had left it. Jake had never been so happy to see that beat-up old transport. He carried Kira up the ramp and into the airlock. The door sealed behind them and the decontamination cycle began automatically. Clean air flooded the airlock. Real clean air, not the stale atmosphere of the ancient facility. Jake set Kira down gently on the floor and leaned against the wall. They had made it. They were safe. The inner door opened. Jake helped Kira into the ship's medical bay. He activated the emergency medical systems and placed her on the examination table. Scanners hummed to life, checking her vital signs. The ship's computer spoke in a calm, neutral voice. Patient shows signs of severe physical trauma. Neural activity normal. No foreign organisms detected. Treatment recommended. IV fluids, pain medication, rest. Jake started the automated treatment. The ship wasn't equipped for major medical procedures, but it could handle basic care. An IV line inserted itself into Kira's arm, feeding her body the fluids and nutrients it desperately needed. Jake then treated himself. The burns on his skin needed attention. His muscles needed rest. The ship's systems worked efficiently, tending to both of them while Jake programmed the emergency beacon. The beacon would broadcast on all standard frequencies. It would tell the Exploration Council about the facility, about the entities, about the danger that still lurked in Thesara Prime's deep oceans. This planet needed to stay quarantined. No colonists. No researchers. No one should ever risk awakening those things again. Jake sat in the pilot's seat and sent the message. Then he set the ship's autopilot to maintain orbit and await rescue. A proper medical team would arrive in a few days. Until then, they just had to rest and heal. He walked back to the medical bay. Kira was asleep on the examination table, her breathing steady and strong. The burns on her skin were already starting to heal. The Velrathi healed fast. She would be okay. Jake collapsed into a chair beside her. His own body finally gave out. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind only exhaustion. He closed his eyes and let himself drift into unconscious darkness. 3 days passed before the rescue ship arrived. Jake and Kira spent that time recovering in the relative safety of their vessel. They slept, they ate, they talked. Kira told Jake about her world, about the cities carved into crystal mountains, about her family who had worried when she chose a career exploring dangerous places, about her hope that sharing knowledge between species would make the galaxy safer for everyone. Jake told her about Earth, about growing up near the ocean, about joining the Exploration Service because he wanted to see what was out there beyond humanity's borders, about his belief that humans were stronger when they worked with others rather than alone. They both talked about what happened in the facility. The fear, the pain, the moment when each of them thought they would die. And they talked about the strange bond that had formed between them. A connection built on trust and sacrifice and survival. When the rescue ship finally arrived, a full medical team came aboard. They examined both Jake and Kira thoroughly. The doctors were amazed by what they found. Both patients had survived an infection that had a 0% survival rate in all previous cases. The decontamination process had saved them, but only because they had endured it. You should both be dead, one doctor said bluntly. The pain from that treatment causes most people to go into shock. Their hearts stop. But somehow you stayed conscious through the whole thing. Jake looked at Kira. She looked back at him. They both knew why they had survived. Because they weren't alone. Because they had each other to focus on. Because giving up wasn't an option when someone else was counting on you. The Exploration Council debriefed them for hours. Jake and Kira told the whole story. Every detail. The council members listened with growing horror. They had almost sent colonists to Thesara Prime. Families, children. All of them would have been infected. You saved potentially billions of lives, a council member said. If those entities had reached populated space, we might not have been able to stop them. But Jake and Kira didn't feel like heroes. They felt like two people who had gotten lucky, who had survived because of knowledge left behind by researchers who hadn't been so fortunate. The council promised to seal Thesara Prime permanently. No more missions to the surface. No more research. The planet would be marked as a quarantine zone with automated defense systems to keep anyone from landing. Jake and Kira were also promised medals, commendations, and positions in the Council's advisory board. But neither of them cared about recognition. They just wanted to heal and move on with their lives. Before they went their separate ways, Jake found Kira on the observation deck of the rescue ship. She stood at the window looking out at the stars. Jake joined her and they stood in comfortable silence for a while. "Thank you," Kira finally said. Her translator had been replaced with a new one, but her voice still had that unique musical quality. "You could have let me go to the generators. You could have saved yourself. But you didn't. Neither did you," Jake replied. "You went into that water to reach the chamber. You could have stayed safe." "I suppose we are both foolish," Kira said with something that might have been a smile. "Maybe. Or maybe we just understood what needed to be done." Kira nodded. "What will you do now? Return to Earth?" Jake thought about it. He could go home, take a desk job, never risk his life on another mission, but that wasn't who he was, and it wasn't what he wanted. "I'll probably take some time off," he said. "Let these burns heal. Then back to work. There are a lot of worlds out there that need exploring." "Dangerous work," Kira observed. "Yeah, but someone has to do it." "Then perhaps we should do it together," Kira suggested. "You have proven to be an adequate partner in crisis situations." Jake laughed. "Adequate. High praise from a Velrathi scientist. I could say the same about you. For a human, you are surprisingly resilient." They stood together at the window watching the stars, two people from different worlds who had faced death and survived, who had learned to trust each other in the worst possible circumstances, who had found strength not just in themselves but in each other. The galaxy was full of dangers. Ancient facilities hiding deadly secrets, worlds with mysteries that could kill the unwary, threats that lurked in dark corners waiting to be discovered. But the galaxy also had people like Jake and Kira, people who would risk everything to protect others, who would endure unthinkable pain to do what was right, who proved that cooperation between species wasn't just possible, it was essential. Jake thought about humanity's place in the wider universe. Humans weren't the strongest species. They weren't the smartest or the fastest or the most advanced, but they had something valuable to offer. Stubbornness, determination, an unreasonable refusal to give up even when all logic said they should. And when humans found partners who shared those traits, partners like Kira who combined intelligence with courage and compassion, they became unstoppable. The rescue ship turned away from Thesara Prime, leaving the quarantined world behind. In the cargo hold, sealed containers held all the data Jake and Kira had recovered. Information about the entities. Research notes about the decontamination process. Everything needed to protect future explorers from making the same mistakes. Jake and Kira would write their reports. They would testify before councils and committees. Their story would become required reading for anyone entering the exploration service. A cautionary tale about the dangers of ancient research facilities and mysterious evacuations. But it would also be a story about survival, about two people who found themselves in an impossible situation and somehow came out the other side, about trust and sacrifice and the bonds that form when you face death together. Years later, when people asked Jake about his most dangerous mission, he would tell them about Thesara Prime, about the flooding and the infection and the pain of decontamination. But he would also tell them about Kira, about how an alien scientist from a distant world taught him that true strength isn't just about enduring hardship alone. It's about having someone beside you who refuses to let you fall. And Kira would tell a similar story on her own world, about a stubborn human who dove into contaminated water to save her life, who carried her across rough terrain when her legs wouldn't work, who proved that the galaxy's newest spacefaring species had more to offer than anyone expected. The water had been dangerous. The entities had been terrifying. But the real test hadn't been surviving the physical threats. It had been finding someone you could trust with your life, someone who would make impossible choices and endure unbearable pain, because letting you die was simply not acceptable. Jake and Kira had found that in each other, and that was worth more than all the medals and commendations the Council could give them. That was the real treasure they brought back from Thesara Prime. Not just data about ancient threats, but proof that different species could work together, could trust each other, could save each other. The galaxy was a little safer because of what they did. and they were both a little stronger because of what they survived together.